Uh, okay, we'll get started now. I think there's a new microphone, so the sounds are slightly different. Um, Sorry for being late, and there was a lab just before this, which ran a little bit over time, as usual. Uh, so this week, we're going to come back to Vue. So we started the lecture, second week, we start on the Vue. We get a quick overview of different directives, if you still remember, the Vue if, the on, and the, say, double curly bracket template, etc. Now we're going to go to each of those in more details. Okay. Okay, this is what we covered the last week. We talked about HTML, CSS. So basically, we covered everything you need to do for the first coursework in terms of design, the HTML, CSS. Now is the handling of the data and user interaction. And last year, in the second year, actually, you did this, and also something similar, an online shop, which you're using plain JavaScript. And this year, we're going to using Vue, and which is actually designed to make these interaction easier. Okay, and so that's right. This is kind of just a quick review of what we covered. Like now, it's 3 weeks ago. So for everything, you need a Vue instance, and which is something like this, and you defined in your code, and so it's just as any other variables you can create. You can create a variable which is number, a variable which is array, or a variable which is a JSON object, and you can. This is again, it also is just one variable. It has a name, which you can define. And what it does slightly differently is on this side, you have this new Vue and then bracket and curly bracket, etc. So what it does is essentially it's defining an instance of Vue. Vue will be, if you learn the Java or some other language, object-oriented language, it will have this concept of class. So you can define, I don't know, a person as a class or maybe a module as a class. Then you can create lots of different instances of the class. So this is what essentially this instance does. Okay, and then a little bit more in depth is in terms of the design patterns. So design patterns are like the general guidelines or rules, good things to do when you design a more complex software. And usually if you have a small program, say maybe 10, 20 lines, you don't really need to follow any particular patterns. But if you have hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands lines of code, you need a pattern to help you to organize these codes. So for example, you definitely don't want to have, say, 10,000 lines of code in one single file. That just makes your life very difficult if you want to find any or change anything in the code. So you want to break them down into, say, smaller files and somehow organize them better. So here is a different pattern called MVVM. Okay. Let me see. Do I have another slide to talk about this? Okay. If you're interested, there's a bit more details. That stands for MView, model view, and view model. Slightly kind of awkward name, but essentially the general idea is you separate the code that you use to display anything. So basically the part user see, that's what we usually call the view, which is say the buttons, the forms, anything user see. And then there's the part which is usually called the model, that's the data you have. So for the coursework, the data you have will be, say, the data about different courses or classes, and then data about the users. These are the models. A large part of your code is somehow map the data, which is model, to what users see on their screen. So you need to decide, okay, essentially how do you load all the coursework information from the database or a collection to, say, a form or a table on the page. That's largely what your code do. And also the other part is with some user interaction, and how that changes or affects the view. So these are all the view model, and sometimes it's also called a controller. So, and in part, this is a way to organize your entire code. So that means you have certain part of the code only dealing with data, certain part of code only dealing with how that is displayed, and part of the code only dealing with how these two are connected together. And the good thing is, for example, if you designed in this way, which is called a more modular way of organizing code, let's say currently for the first coursework, we store everything in the local storage, and then for the next coursework, we're going to use MongoDB to store the data. But if you design your code well, so everything dealing with the model will be in this part, then for the second coursework, you will not need to change any front end or the mapping, and only need to change the model part, and your code will still work. That would be the ideal case. Save you lots of effort. And if you imagine you put every code, say, where you access data, where you create front end, all in the same file and all mixed together, that means if your backend changes, you have to change the entire file, which is less efficient and less maintainable, basically. Okay, let's get back to the. Yeah. Hmm? Okay, let me try to do something so I could show you the bottom of the slides, which currently not showing up. I forgot now. Oh, okay, so it's not that bad. Why it's not? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I guess I couldn't really zoom in, zoom out, and for no obvious reason. And so, okay, then you create your instance using something like this. We talked about little bit the patterns, the model view and controller, or in this case called view model pattern, which the view follows. And then essentially, the view wants to be the controller part of your models. Essentially, and the view wants to be this part, that connects your data with your front end. That's what the view try to do. Okay, and we've probably all seen this example before. So, and when you're creating the view instance, you're passing these information like the EL, say, which sets which items on your page you would link to, some data, maybe some methods as well. So these are called option objects. Essentially, additional information you pass on to the view instance, then it can use them later. Okay, and this is also the concept we mentioned in the second lecture when we give a quick overview of Vue, and is the concept called components, and that is something, and it's not required in the first coursework, but a good way to organize your code. Okay, so let's say this is kind of like one possible breakdown of components of how you do a to-do list. And let's say to-do list will be composed of two components. One is called to-do items, and the other one is to-do list footer, so something at the bottom of your to-do app. And then for each to-do items, it has a button, which delete that items from the list, and then another button called edit. And I'll assume there probably will be another area which shows what the text is for that particular to-do. So that's next. So to-do item itself is a component, but it's made up with components in the next level, which is the 2 buttons and potential some text. Okay, so this way you essentially break down your entire code into this kind of tree-like hierarchies. So first, it makes the structure of your code much more cleaner, and the other benefit will be these things you define here can be easily reused in other components. And for example, you can have, I don't know, another different list, and you can reuse the delete or edit button in that particular list. Okay, and the other things we're going to mention here is the components here are also Vue instances. Okay, so we see in the last slides, so this is our Vue instance, and the components is very similar to this. In a sense, only difference is this type of Vue instance is usually the root one, and the other component is also a similar instance. So in a sense, they will be able to accept this kind of options when they are created. You can say set these with a few exceptions compared to root instance. Okay. Again, this we have seen that in the early lecture already. When you create a Vue instance, you will have a data of your instance, which stores all the kind of data in the Vue instance. And for example, the actual text of the each to-do list items will be stored in the data part. Okay, and you're probably already seeing the most interesting part about this data section or data objects of the Vue instance is if it's reactive, in the sense if there's any changes, the display on the page will automatically update. There's nothing you need to do in terms of writing your own code to update the display. Okay, okay. Okay, so here are a little bit of examples and to show how this data works. Okay, so first, if you look at this line here, it says I define a variable. Its name is called the data, and this data itself is what is this data type? Anyone knows? What would you call that? Is it a number, a Boolean value, an array, or JSON object, or something else? A function? What would you call this? Not quite. If it's just one, say I have a variable data equal to 1, and then that's an integer or a number, what this would you call? Array? Object? Yeah, okay. So it's not an array. Array will start with square bracket. If you have a square bracket in this array, and the curly bracket is usually an object or sometimes a JSON object. That's a typical one, which says I have one property called A, and the value of A is 1. Of course, you can have other properties. And to make things more complicated, for a property, its value in this case is 1, but it can be more complex than that. You can have an array as value or another object as a value. Okay, so you can have nested object. Okay, but in this case we have a very simple one. So, and then next part we create a new Vue instance. So this line will be completely normal to you, nothing interesting or special to see, and this part is slightly different in the sense the first data is the data object for the Vue instance. And the second data is this data we defined. Okay, so that's the equivalent of, say, the data object for the view instance is a JSON only has one attribute called A and its value is 1. Okay, so using the same data, same variable name can be slightly confusing in this case. Okay, and then the following line of code is actually trying to show you, okay, how you can change or the relationship of this. So the first one, it says, oops, and it says view.a, sorry, vm.a. So vm is the view instance we created here, and the a will be the attribute a inside its state object. So that should give you a value of 1. And then in this condition, it says the right hand side is data.a. So that's the data and dot a. Okay, so it also gives you the value of 1. So if you run this one, and it should return a value of true. Yeah, that makes sense, hopefully. Okay, and then the next part, it says, how do I say? Okay, the next part is related to this property. So in the JavaScript, for these more complex types like arrays or object, and it is referenced by, sorry, yeah, it is by reference. Or when you say, when you do the equal sign, it's actually not creating a new copy, for example here, not creating a new copy, but actually just passing a reference. So what happens here is if you change the data inside the view instance to 2, and then it will change the original data as well, and vice versa. For example, if you change the value of this and data and changes A value to 3, and then that will also affect the property. Sorry, the attribute inside the view instance data object. Okay, just say in a sense, the data and the data inside the view instance is reactive or linked in some way, and the change of one will affect the other. That's all. Okay. Okay. And so this is, again, a little bit kind of details, but very important to know. And so in our examples, we call this property reactive in the sense if one changes, the other will change automatically. Somehow they are linked. It's called reactive. But this is only true if the property exists when the instance is created. So if we look at this one, so when we're creating this VM instance, we define what the data is, which contains A. But if later on we do this, and we say vm.b equal to hi, what it does is add a new attribute called, or a new property called b, and its value is called hi to the view instance. That's what it does. Okay, but because this is added after the instance is already created, any changes to the B will not trigger any update. So basically that is not reactive if you add the instance later. Sorry, add the property later. So in that sense, so if we want all your properties in the view instance to be reactive, and you have to define them when you create the view instance, and even when you don't know what the value should be yet. So in this case, for this view instance, you have these properties in the data. So the first one is called new to do text. So that will be, for example, to store the text user entered when they want to create a new to-do items. So obviously, you don't know what is the kind of task user going to create when you create the Vue instance, but you needed that to be there to make it reactive. So you assign an empty value for it to start with, but you at least have a copy or have the property there in the data section. And yeah, similarly for the other property, for example, this to-dos will be the array stores all the to-do items. Obviously, you don't know what kind of array people will create for, and you just use an empty array to start with. Okay, and again, you're probably not going to encounter this in your actual code, but it is possible to use something called a freeze. That's a function come with JavaScript, so it's not part of the Vue. So it's just plain JavaScript, and it does exactly what the name indicates. It will freeze something, and as a result, not allowing that to be changed anymore. So Vue wants to update, and when it's reactive, if the value changes, everything that use the same value would change. But if you use freeze, just as you do here, say object.freeze, and then object will be freezed, and you cannot change that with Vue. And sorry, is this big enough? Can you see from the back, or okay, they have to use a monitor? Okay, if we look at this simple example and this cell here, and we defined a div which is ID called app, and the inside we want to use that's a Vue template which reference to full, which will be something inside the Vue instance object. So if you look at here, the Vue instance will link to this div, and its data part is object, which is defined here, which is the object which only has one attribute, called the full, and its value is bar. So this is all fine, except on this line it says object freeze, and then this one will not allow to be changed or updated anymore. Okay, and so when you, on this part, and it says button V on click. If you remember, that's a Vue part. It says when this button is clicked, it will set the value of full to pass or any other values. But actually, because this object is freeze here, it will not be able to change. Does that make sense? Okay, just conserve the time. Otherwise, I would show you in live code, but maybe the more complex examples later on. Okay. Okay. So, as we said, and previously, so if you say this is our Vue instance, currently it's called a VM, and if you say VM dot something, it's actually returning whatever is the data object inside the instance. Okay, and in the case if we want to say access other properties like the EL or the methods or the data object itself, you need to use this dollar sign. So if you say VM dot dollar sign, it will give you whatever the value is here, and the EL will be this. Basically, that's a ID, and also you can have a watch function, and it becomes okay. So this is a way to say I want to do something when the value of A changes. So what it does is it says I want to watch A. The A is part of my data object because it's equal to, the data object is equal to this data. It has a property called A, and it says when something changes, I will run this function. whatever function was defined here. Okay, I'm going to see more examples of how to use this and a little bit later on. Okay. So yeah, Vue actually have to do lots of things in the back, so behind the hood, which you don't quite see, to keep the things reactive. In the sense, for example, if the values in data object changes, the display on the page will automatically change. There's lots of things Vue have to do in the background to make that happen. And there will be a diagram a little bit later on, for example, and then it allows you to do adding a little bit of hook, something called hooks, which allows, say, these things will trigger when a certain stage of this background activity happens. I really need a scrolling function. Let me see if I can get it. No. Which one would have that? Okay, almost done. Okay, and no. Okay. It was missing. Ah, okay. Sorry. Let me see. Yeah. Very quickly, and this picture was missing and previously, and it didn't load. So we explained we have the view, which is what the users see, and the model, which is what the data is, and the view model is in the in between, handling the binding of from the model to the view, and that's what the view tried to do. Okay. Okay. Finally have this scroll bar now. Um, so if you look at this code here, it used something called a hook, which is, say, created. We're going to see later on. So that's the early stage of all the things that Vue need to do in the backend. The only difference here in this Vue instance, you have defined the data, which is fine. And instead of have method, it says created and then define the function follow afterwards. And the function does very simple things. It just do a console log. There's nothing interesting. But what and this created says and means is when the backend Vue process reach the created stage of the Vue instance, it will run this function. So that's basically called a created hook, and then you can have hook at different stages of the Vue instance, and these are called mounted and updated or destroyed. And there should be a picture. Okay, and so this diagram shows you the different stages of the backend Vue process where you can allow you to add different hooks. And so this is what happens when you actually say in your JavaScript code, you say something equal to new Vue instance. And when it's run, it will actually go through all these things behind the scene, which you don't really see. It was to create the Vue instance. And each of these red arrows is where you can add a hook. Okay, so when it's first run, it will try to initialize events and life cycles. And before it initializing the injections and reactivity, it will trigger events called before create. Then in a sense, you can create a before create hook. And so to do that, what you need to do is here, and if you use before create and then define any function after that, that function will be called when the process gets to that stage. Okay, and then next step will be initializing injection and reactivity, and this is when the created hook will be called. So that's when the previous examples, the code run written there will be called here. Okay, then we check the Vue instance has this EL option. So far we always had EL, which links the Vue instance to an object. And if it's a yes, and check if it has a template option. Okay, and then if it's no, if it's yes, it's this. If it's no, does that. Okay, now there's another one called a before month. So this is essentially means when the up to here the Vue instance is created, and this is the mount essentially means apply that to the actual DOM in your web page to make it display. So you have this before mount and mounted stage. And once the Vue instance is mounted, essentially it's like it's active or it's working. Then once ever there are any changes, the display part will change with whatever the change in the Vue instance. For example, a variable a, the value changes, and whatever displayed on the page will change with it. That's this circle. And then there's two more, is before destroy and destroy. So again, you don't have to worry about when Vue manages all these. When a component or instance is no longer needed, it will destroy it to release, say, the memories or other things it takes. But then you have two more chances to create two other hooks that you can say, okay, just before the destroy or when it's destroyed, if you want to do something, that will be possible to do it here. The syntax will be the same, just to say instead of doing, say, created has a function, you say destroyed has a function, and that will be the function get running when this reaches this stage. Okay, and so that's what we're going to all talk about in terms of Vue instance. And so this is follow or in terms of reading, this is follow the Vue instance part of the official guide. So that's the link there, which is very similar to what we just covered. Okay, so we're gonna go to the second part now. We'll do the same first. Oh, okay. Okay, so the next part is talking a little bit about template, which we already seen. Before we go into a bit more details, so maybe there's useful to know something called a virtual DOM. So we all know DOM, which is the page we see in the browser. It can be represented as DOM, which compose all these HTML elements, which organize into a hierarchical structure. And so what Vue does is, when there's any changes, it does not update the actual DOM directly, because that can be quite expensive in the sense, for example, if you remove some elements from the page, then you have to recalculate the entire layout of the page and causing everything to move around. That can be quite disruptive. and maybe it's only end up being going back to the previous states because that item is being removed and somehow later on add back onto the page with different value. That's all it does. Okay, so what did it has doing something called the virtual DOM. It's almost just like a copy of the real DOM, but it does not used for display. And it will change the virtual DOM, apply all the changes to the virtual DOM, and before it apply the changes to the actual DOM. So basically, before you see the changes. So as I said, and the viewer will try to figure out the minimum changes to the existing DOM and to apply whatever changes you needed. And that's what's achieved with this. Okay, and if we look at, yeah, okay. So this is the example we've seen before already. So we have a div element, and inside this itself is bounded, and for the unordered list, for each list items, we're using v4 is and try to get all the to-dos, so all the elements from the to-do array in the Vue instance. And this part, the double curly bracket, is the so-called template. And obviously, this is probably the simplest possible template, and it's a to-do. To-do here is the alias for any element from the to-do s, which is the array here, and it says for any element inside here, I want to get the text property of that. So that's the text. So I will return this part. So that's probably the simplest possible array. Okay, so it has some maybe some more technical names for this, and so this process is called data binding, in the sense you're binding something on your page to the data in your Vue instance. And this is called the mustache syntax, just because this double curly bracket, someone thinks it's maybe closer to mustache. And yeah, and that's really just it. So just these are particular terms to bind text. Okay. And later on, we have this example called something called the v1s, and it just says that's the case you use when you only want to the data or the text being bounded once, and then later on, if there's any changes to the view variable or the view data, you don't want it to affect the page, then you use v1s. So here we bind using a template or mapping to the message, assuming that's part of the data object or the Vue instance. But because you used v1s here, later on if the value of message changes or MSC changes, and this will not change. Okay. And so you can also actually, instead of just adding text, you can add in HTML as well. In the sense, you can include an HTML tag in the data passed onto the Vue data instance. And you need to use something called Vue HTML directive to say, okay, I want to pass some HTML code, not just text. So, it is actually not. And so if you look at these two examples here, and the first one use a simple template which contains one variable. Its name is called raw HTML with certain values, and it only just use double curly brackets. So whatever the value of this raw HTML will be just shown as text when it's rendered. That's why you have here says using mustache, and this part is actually the value of this raw HTML variable. And here it's not treated as HTML code, so it's just displayed like this. And in the second example, and it's using something called the HTML directive, so it's still the same code, but here it says and instead of double curly bracket, it says v_html equal to this one. So this is the variable name. Then whatever value of this will be treated as HTML code. So so it will yeah. So what it should display is say you have this part of the text and using the HTML directive, and still the same here, but this part will be replaced as the HTML code, or replaced by the HTML code stored in this variable, which is this part. Oops. Does that make any sense? Or okay, so maybe I should do this in a live example. Oh, maybe I have one already. Let me see if I have instance template. Okay, anyway. Okay, so I have the code here. So I have I defined this div, and its ID is called example1, which is linked to this Vue instance, and its example called example1. Okay. Okay, so this is slightly different. And here, instead of just define this as part of the data, and it has a function, it will return this raw HTML. Okay, so when you first run this, let me see. Oh, don't have live view. Okay, let me see. Okay, yeah. Maybe show this part. So let me go into the actual code itself. Okay, so this is the part, and where the maybe let me put this below, maybe easier. So this is a line of code where you just use a normal mustache instance. You can't really see it here, and it's already got to be replaced. So okay, we have to come back here. So the first paragraphs is just using the normal mustache, and it refers to this raw HTML, which is this one here, which essentially is just this string here. And then in the HTML code, in the HTML page, you will see this line of code will be just displayed as as text. Whereas in the second line here, and it's using a vdirect, and then this will be interpreted as a HTML code. So what it does is will display some text, and it's inside a span and has a styling or formatting saying the text should be red. So that's why if you look at this page here, that's exact what this produced. So that's a paragraph. Inside the paragraph, it has this span, and the span, it has this line of text. So basically, instead of showing this line as a text, it is treated as HTML code when added to the page. Okay. Back to the slides. Okay, and then there's cautions and there's a warning there. So using HTML can be dangerous sometimes, in the sense whatever follows, for example, stored in raw HTML, will be treated as code and it will be executed. So there is a chance people might put in some malicious code and allow it to be executed on your page. Okay, so if you use this type of representation, the double curly bracket, whatever inside will be just treated as text. It will never be executed in any way, so it's always safe. Whereas if you use VHTML, whatever follows will be treated as a code and actually will be executed. So that could potentially can be a way for people to run malicious code. Okay, and so that's another thing of binding. So we already seen this before, vbind. So when you want to change the attributes of the element, the text itself we use double curly bracket. But if you want to say set the attributes to different values, you use this vbind directive. So we've seen this before. We say that for this div tags, I want to change its ID to something. Okay, the ID will not be dynamic ID. Instead, it will depend. Dynamic ID will be a a variable in the data object of the Vue instance, and depends on its value at the time. That will be the ID of this div. Does that make sense? Okay, and if we look at the next example, and it says I have a button, I have a property of the button called disabled. So that's a property you can set to whether the button is disabled or not. Basically, if this disabled is true, then the button will be disabled. Then you can use your Vue to control that whether the button is disabled or not by doing vbind first and make the value of this disabled property equal to something called is button disabled. Okay, then depends on the value of this, then this is gonna change, make the button able or disabled, enabled or disabled. I think I have an example here. Yeah. Okay, if we look at this example code, we have a div called app2, which is linked to here, and then I have a div. I bind its ID to dynamic ID, which is the value, which is a property of the Vue instance, and then the ID of this div will change depends on this variable value. And similarly, we have this button whether it's disabled or not depends on this variable value, which is another variable in the Vue instance, and you can change that dynamically to change the button status. So if we go to the example we opened early on, okay, so first we can pick the div if we can. So we can see that there, the div itself is currently called new div because that was the value we set initially. Give it to, it's called new div. And then if we change that, for example, we say app2 dot what is that called? Dynamic ID. What is the view called? VM. Okay. So that's the Vue instance. And then if we call the dynamic ID, currently you can see its view is its value is new ID and equal to, let's say, called ID2. So here we're changing the values of these Vue variables. And then if we go back here, look at elements, you can see the ID of your div changed. Okay, that's the result of doing this binding here in your code. So in a sense, you can dynamically change the ID of elements on your page this way, which will be quite difficult to do if you're just using plain JavaScript. Okay, so we can do the same to change whether the button is disabled or not. So obviously, currently this button is active, so I can click, even it doesn't really do anything. And if we look at the code, whether it's disabled is linked to the value of this variable, which is currently sent as false. And if in the console, let me see if we can show console here. Okay, yeah. Okay, so let me see if I can move it up a little bit. Yeah. That's our button, and here if I change that particular value, sorry, it's at the very bottom of the page. And equal to true, in the sense it will now be disabled. And you can see now this button is no longer, you can't really actively, you can't click it anymore. And similarly, you can change it back, you can change it to false. Okay, so this is another way that you can use the bind and then use the Vue variables to control the status of the elements on your page. Okay, so this is, like I say, a little bit more about this double curly bracket before. And so far, we only use fairly straightforward way of, say, just refer to a variable in the Vue instance, or maybe a property of a variable in the Vue instance. But you can do more complex things as these as well. So you can say, let's say number is a Vue variable. You can say number +1. It will just calculate. Anyone knows what this does? No one? So it says, okay, question mark, yes, column, and no. Anyone? No? Yeah. So it's a shorthand way doing if, this, and then. So what essentially it says, if okay, do yes, else no. That's all it does. So it just says, if the value of okay is true in some way, for example, it's a number greater than 0, for example, or it's just say any text string, it will be true, then this part will become a yes. Otherwise, it will be no. There's a slightly more complex way, but you can use that and use this inside the Vue template as well. For example, if the OK is a variable from the Vue, then you can use that to control whether it's going to display yes or no here. Okay, and this is something we've seen in the previous example. So let's say message itself is an array, and it can do split, reverse, and join. These are all predefined JavaScript array functions in that, which actually what it does is reverse every letters in the order in the array. So basically, so it can not just say bind a variable or maybe a property variable. You can do a little bit more complex JavaScript expressions in the inside double curly bracket as well. Okay, and so the restrictions is it can only have one expression. So these will not work. Okay, so the first one, this one will not work in the sense it is a statement, not an expression. So it's try to say define a variable which is a name a and its value will be 1. So this is a statement. So usually you return in your code it's a single line itself and doesn't really return anything. So that doesn't work. Okay, and this does not work either because it's not one single one. So essentially, this is treated as two lines. You have the first line, which is if condition, and the second line is a return message. So you have more than one expression. Again, it does not work. So if you want to do something like this, you have to use this kind of expressions. Yeah. Okay. You can even use the mass, and date functions inside the template. But these are the only two you can use, and it doesn't allow you to use other more powerful functions just to stop people doing naughty things. But say, for example, you can do mass.random function inside a double curly bracket, and that still will work. Okay. We mentioned this previously already, and so Vue have these things called directives. So like the v-for, the double curly, not double curly bracket. That's the template. That's the v-on, etc. So all these things will start with Vue dash, which is called the prefix, and we think this one is called v-for. That's one of those. Okay, so this is another one which I don't think we introduced before, and that's called the v-if. So what it does, it controls whether this element is gonna exist or being removed from the page. So it says v-if and then followed by a variable called scene. So it depends on the value of scene. If the scene is true, then this will display on the page. And if the scene is false, then this will disappear from the page. And again, that provides a way for you to control what gets displayed on the page. Okay, we've seen vbind before, so if you remember, where did we do that? Okay, this is where we did vbind. To change the attributes of the element, we change the ID or change the value for the disabled attribute. Okay, and you can change the URL for a link on your page this way by binding it to a variable in your Vue instance. Okay, just remember the URL, actually new URL will not be the URL, will be whatever value that is in your Vue instance. Okay, and we also seen this before, and you can use v-on to handle the click of the buttons. So you say v-on when it's clicked, do something, usually the name of a function. So you've done that already. You should use that in your to-do list exercise. Okay, and makes things slightly even more complicated. And in the sense, previously we can use vbind to change a particular attribute. Then in a sense, the attribute itself is already predefined. So whether it's the ID of the div, or maybe it's the disabled status of a button. And in here, you can even actually select which attributes you want to change using Vue. So basically, following this syntax, and you can change an attribute name will be maybe I should have some examples. The attribute name will be a variable in your Vue instance, and it can be, say, an ID, it can be disabled or any other attributes, or even styling, for example, to change CSS formatting, and then followed by its value. So you can change both, you can control both attribute name and its value using Vue. Okay. And in this example, for example, as to say, you can set the values of this attribute name to href. So that means it's a link, and make the URL, some URL, maybe say google.com. Then it becomes a link where it's linking to Google webpage. But you can change the attribute name to either say ID equal to something else, and then it becomes the ID of that particular link. Okay, so following similar ideas, here you bind, and it's not using vbind anymore. And in this case, we're using vbind. We are using v-on. If you remember, v-on is where you do, eventually that's event handler, and you decide what get being run or invoked when, say, certain events happens. Most common one will be click, and then other things, for example, you can say mouse over, that's another event. You can also run something. And then the Vue allows you to dynamically change the event that will trigger the function besides what the function is. So you can dynamically change, say, okay, now I want to add a new function to the element. So when it's mouse over, it will do something. And you can do this this way. Okay, yeah. So in this example, it says we can change the event name here to focus. That means when element becomes a focus, then it will do something, basically run the function with its name called do something. Do you know what is the focus on a page? No, it's a bit different. It's not the mouse over. Anyone knows what is the focus? Okay, so if you go to any page, like here, sometimes you will see like a dashed box around certain things. That's the focus. So let me see if I can find it here. So basically, if you press tab, and it will change the focus. Can you see the focus now? And if you keep tapping, it will go through everything there. So that becomes the focus. And eventually, for example, on the form, when user typing in certain field, then that field has a focus. Or you switch between fields, you click on the field, and that field, another field will get focused. And you can say use that as event to trigger certain things. Okay, so basically it's very powerful. It allows you to dynamically say which attributes I want to change of element, or what handler I want to handle certain what type of events completely using Vue. Okay, so basically that says you're not allowed use to null as the so basically this must have certain valid values if it's either it's an event or a function, sorry, event or attribute. Okay, so this one is something you cannot do. So what it does is says I want to say change. We want to bind certain properties to whatever the value is, the value of this variable whose name is called value. But instead of just using a Vue variable, it says full plus bar. Okay, so if this is a string, that will be okay. But here, you cannot use this to specify the particular attributes you want to change. Does that make sense? So if it does not have plus bar at the end, that's completely fine, assuming the full is one Vue instance or one variable. But you're not allowed to say add bar or do other things, expressions like this. Okay, and the workaround will be called the computed the property, which we're going to be covered later on. Okay, yeah. Again, will be a I guess a relatively small but maybe important thing is this property or the value of this some attribute variable Vue variable, and its value will be automatically converted to lowercase. That's just how the browser works. And then, so if basically if you want to enforce certain capital letters, it will not work in the value. Okay, and let's say the value of this some attributes is capital letter ABC, and when it's applied here, that will be converted automatically to small case ABC. That's all it says. That's the thing. It will always happen when you set a bind a property or event handler. Okay. Okay, it's almost there. And so, for example, and you can also have this so-called modifiers, and it just says it has to be bound in special way. And so this example, and which is a form, and it says v on, so submit, and then dot prevent. Okay, so what it does is says, and I want to say specify what happens when the form is submitted. So that's what this part up to submit does. It says v-on when the form is submitted, I want to run this onSubmit function. Okay, but it has dot prevent. What it does is it prevents the default behavior of form submission. Okay, anyone knows what's the default behavior of form submission? No? So if you have a form and you have a click the submit button, what will happen? Yeah? Yes, it will send data. But also say sometimes the send data part is actually okay. But sometimes it will automatically refresh the page by default. And that might not be the behavior you want because once you refresh, you lost everything you entered, which can be a bit annoying. So this dot prevent will prevent that automatic refresh behavior. So you still have everything, you have control of everything that was entered there. So it can be useful. Yeah. Okay, and so for some of the more common Vue directives, it have shorthand representation. That means you can write even less code. So for example, the shorthand for vbind is just 2 columns, just a column. Okay, so this here is the same as here. So basically, if you take out the vbind completely, these few letters, only leave the column, it still works. The Vue would know how to interpret. And this one, as we see, is a vbind where you set both the properties you want to change and the value for that property. Okay. Okay. So von is another one which you use a lot. Then you have another shorthand. So instead of having von and then column, you can just use an @ sign. So that's the equivalent of von. Okay, just to make the code even shorter. That's all. Okay, almost there. Oops. Okay, so that comes finish the template part. So we talk about different directives and then the shorthand, and you can also including more complex things like JavaScript expressions in these templates. Okay, and very quickly, do we have time for this? Okay, and just in case I didn't have time to finish all the lecture slides because we only have a few minutes left, and if you look at it's not here. And if you look at the lecture slides for this week, we actually have 4 sets. So far, okay, so if you look at it, we actually had 4 sets. So far, we've covered instance and template. And then we need to cover the computed property and the list, which we might not be able to finish. And then you will need to have to look at them after the class in your own time. Okay, actually, we mentioned about the computed property and previously already is in the case where you actually use Vue to change the property, for example, you want to set value, but the change itself is not just a simple variable name. It's like, say, a variable, say, plus certain text strings, or say with other, say, expressions, which is something you're not allowed to do. Okay, and in this example we've just seen before, and that is actually something you can do in a Vue template. Inside the curly brackets, you're doing lots of 3 different functions applied to a string. That is possible, but that is actually not recommended. And for these ones, and it's recommended to using something called a computed property. Okay, and so that is a simple div with the ID, which will be linked to our Vue instance, and then you have a 2 simple templates. And the which one is just showing the value replaced here with the value of message variable, and the other one is called the reversed message. We're actually going to use or represent or create using the computed properties. Okay, so if we look at this Vue instance and we link that with the ID examples, we have the data called the message, which is hello. So that means this paragraph will be, say, original message is hello. And then we have the computed. So that's another section or another object of the instance, and it just adds data, EL, or method. It's have a list of computed properties. In this one, we define something called the reverse the message, which is a function which actually does basically reverse all the letters in the hello. So instead of putting this line of code and in the template itself, which is usually not recommended because it's too long for a simple template expression, and you create a computed property, which is called reverse message, and use that here. Okay, that's the general idea. Okay, and if you run that, it will give you the reverse or whatever string. And so if the original string is hello, in our previous case, it will be reverse all the letters. And if it's goodbye, again, it will do the same thing. Okay, I think this is the last point I want to cover. And so is say, and when to use computed property and when to use method. For example, in this case, we can equally, and instead of using a computed property, we can just run the function. The function will return the text and will be replaced here. That's completely okay. And in the code itself is also quite similar as well. Say the only difference will be instead of methods here, which defines your functions, and it will be compute for the computed property. The rest of the code will be the same. Okay. So the point is when to use which and why. Okay, as we said, you could say define the function or the method in your Vue instance and achieve the same results. So all you need to do is say the method. The code here is exactly the same as before. Okay, so the main difference is the computed property are cached based on their reactive dependencies. And does anyone knows what cached means here? Yeah. So essentially, it just says something usually is the results stored. It's not permanently, just temporarily. The only purpose is say next time you don't have to do exactly the same thing. You can get rid of the same straight away. So for example, you might cache the result of a query to the database. Say you just select say the average price from the product table. Then what happens is you have to go to the database, it have to retrieve all the price, calculate the average, and then return the value. But that value, the average price, can be cached, some in a sense saved. Then next time, if someone else needs the same value, you can just use the cached version rather than say go to the database, do all the calculation again, and then get the value back. So that's essentially what cached means. So for example, it's used a lot in say Google search engines. And it's not going to search all the entire database every time you entering a query. Most of these queries actually are cached in the sense other people have searched that many, many times. And when you need to do it, it just say show you what is the results being saved from the previous searches. Okay, so the main difference between the computed property and the function is say the computed property is cached. That means in the result will be saved there. And for the simple examples we have here, calculating reverse string, which is very simple, and that's okay. That's not going to make too much differences. And but the method is going to. But sometimes when it's very complicated operations involved, then it could take a long time. And then for the method, every time it's called, it will go do everything, always. Whereas the computed property, it will check if anything, say the value changed. If not, then it will use it. and use the cache results instead of to compute everything again. And so yeah, so basically in the sense, and sometimes the computer property would have a performance advantage because it does not have to do all the steps in the functions again. Okay. Okay, yeah, I think we'll stop there. So there's a few other slides. Please finish after the class.